A lot can happen in the next 3 years. Like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans are available for these changing times. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they offer budget-friendly, flexible coverage for people who are in between jobs or missed open enrollment. The plans last nearly 3 years in some states, with access to a nationwide network of doctors and hospitals. So for whatever tomorrow brings, United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans may be for you. Learn more at uh1.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. It's day 4 of Waterloo Remembered, and today we have the last in our triple bill of interviews on forgotten foreign forces. I'm really privileged today to be joined by Vanya Bellinger, who is a scholar from the United States. Vanya, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on. Let's jump straight in with your work. Tell us a bit about your own research.
Well, my research, I can explain it like really briefly. It's everything Karl von Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz is the big, or we like to say, the most influential Western thinker, military thinker, and his book on war is the foundational text everyone at military academies, service schools, and so on studies. So I got sucked into the field as well. I wrote the book on Karl von Clausewitz's wife, Marie von Clausewitz, because she's the one who actually published on war. He died, left the manuscripts with her, and so on. And I was lucky because the intimate correspondence between Karl and Marie von Clausewitz fell into my lap. So that's how I wrote my book. That's how I made my reputation, and that's how I ended up teaching at in a service school in the United States.
Yeah, because you work for the US Air Force, don't you? Which is a bit of an odd one when you think that you've got somebody who specializes in the Napoleonic era when, quite obviously, air warfare wasn't a factor. You know, it's not mentioned in Clausewitz's own war. And yet the US Air Force kind of employs you to teach about that. It's an interesting one. Yes.
People like sometimes react like, why the Air Force, Napoleonic warfare? But like I said, on war, Clausewitz, that's the foundational text. Even when we talk about air power, it still remains the foundational text. Center of gravity, favorite term of all the pilots. So, and of course, more and more, the more you rise in your career as an officer, the more and more joint forces play a role, strategic thought play a role. And that's where Clausewitz and also Napoleonic warfare comes, because we can use many of these examples explaining a lot of the issues commanders are facing.
And tell us a little bit about Clausewitz's role and career within the Napoleonic Wars, because it's quite an interesting one.
Well, Clausewitz, his writings, he based them mostly on his experience in the Napoleonic warfare. He starts very early. He's not quite 12 years old when he fights in the First Revolutionary War. He's like a boy soldier with a flag. marching before the troops. Then, of course, Prussia, because he's Prussian, Prussia is very quickly leaves the Napoleonic warfare, the first, not Napoleonic warfare, sorry, the first Revolutionary War. So he spends his time studying. He comes he's mentored by Gerhard von Scharnhorst, who's the guy reforming the Prussian army. So Clausewitz also fights in the unfortunate campaign for the Prussians. That's Jena-Auerstadt campaign in 1806. Clausewitz is heartbroken from that campaign, but he's actually one of the guys who fought with distinction in Auerstadt. Then he's like a prisoner of war for a little while in France, comes back, starts working for Scharnhorst again, and he is in the midst of this military reform movement that basically overhauls the Prussian army and prepares it to fight against Napoleon. 1812. Prussia, however, becomes an unwilling ally of France. So Clausewitz resigns and in a very dramatic move moves to Russia. So he participates in 1812 campaign, but fights in Russian uniform, comes back 1813 back to Prussia. He's not admitted in the Prussian army because of this dramatic gesture. So he spends 1813, 1814 fighting again, but in a Russian uniform. And only 1815, he's back in Russian army, and he becomes the chief of staff of the 3rd Prussian Army Corps. So he fights actually not in Waterloo, but in the Twin Battle, which is the Battle of Wavre. That's the battle that prevents Grouchy from coming to Napoleon's aid.
It's worth us dwelling on that a little bit, because some of our listeners might not necessarily be familiar with the role of the Prussians in the Waterloo campaign. Take us briefly through what happens to the Prussian army and their role in the defeat of Napoleon.
So most people usually concentrate on Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, which is the great drama, the great battle, but actually the campaign starts a couple of days earlier. This is when Napoleon secretly leaves Paris and crosses the Belgian border. That's actually where the Prussians meet him. We have the first Prussian Corps actually fighting him, but retreating very slowly, so to give time to Wellington and Prince von Blücher, who's the Prussian commander, to gather their armies. So the campaign officially starts on June 15th. And then we have a big battle, the Battle of Ligny, which is on the 16th. That's the same time, for the British listeners, that's Quatre Bras, where Wellington is fighting Quatre Bras, but it's the small engagement. Actually, the big engagement is in Ligny. And this is where the Prussians actually suffer huge defeat in that moment, but by sheer luck, or there is still debates how that things happen. Instead of going back east, falling back on their line of retreat, the Prussians still think preserving the connection with Wellington, which is the most important thing. So they actually fall back up north. So they go to Wavre. And Napoleon kind of gets faulty intelligence, so he's not expecting them to be up north. And this is where again, there is conversations with Wellington, and there is the promise to support him in Waterloo. So the Prussians, although they are really tired, the army has been beaten really badly in Ligny. So the Prussians still hurry to support Wellington. So they arrive around the Fourth Corps arrives around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So they are actually going on the right flank. And they're pretty successful there. They actually turn and rout the French troops. And then we have the First Corps, General Zieten, who goes and supports Wellington. What makes Waterloo decisive battle, and here like the military theorist in me has to explain what makes a battle a decisive battle, is actually the pursuit. That's like the moment when you not only defeat your enemy, but utterly destroy the enemy's will and ability to fight again. So this is where the pursuit, because Wellington's troops, they are so tired, they had to fight that whole day. Actually, the Prussian troops are the ones who do the pursuit and make Waterloo a decisive battle. That's not to minimize Wellington's forces, but we have to understand that battle as a coalition warfare. And of course, many people don't realize, because that's always like Waterloo was won and the war ended, but the war actually did not end, because where Clausewitz was in Wavre, they had to fight Grouchy, and Grouchy was had a forces that were twice the size of the Prussians. So basically, the Third Corps, Clausewitz, they fight this sort of, for them it's kind of meaningless battle, but it has a meaning of holding off Grouchy. So they lose that battle, and then by various reasons, Grouchy manages to escape. And actually the Allies have to pursue him and have to go to Paris. They have to fight one more battle at the gates of Paris, and for that war to be over. So actually the war ends on July 8th. So this is the campaign is much more than just one glorious battle.
It absolutely is. And as you have explained to everybody, the Prussians play an absolutely pivotal role in how Waterloo unfolds, not just on the 18th, but in terms of the strategy. I mean, what people often fail to appreciate is that Wellington and Blucher were in close communication about the plans, even before the Waterloo campaign, in terms of what they wanted to do. And the whole point of Quatre-Bras and Ligny was the fact that Wellington hoped that he wouldn't be attacked at Quatre-Bras and would therefore be able to move his army across to support Blucher at Ligny, in the way that Blucher eventually ended up doing when moving across from Wavre to Waterloo. Why do you think the role of Blucher's army has been downplayed in the history that's been written about the battle and the campaign as a whole?
I think for the most part, that was pretty well known throughout the 19th century. It was seen as a coalition battle. I think the more and more the rise of Prussia and then unification, and then we have, the fear of this great, the German Empire, and then we have also, World War I, World War II. So I think it's more a reflection of our own times than actually what happened in the battle. Wellington never questioned the role Blucher had. He's been very gracious, always explaining it. I think there is also, again, coalition warfare is complicated. Like, I think this is also one of the reasons why, the contributions of the Prussians are forgotten, and why we have such a hard time explaining it, is because coalition warfare is complicated. Even until today, coalition warfare is one of the most complicated forms of warfare. And it's hard to explain it to people. Like, people like a little bit more simpler narratives, and of course there is like this small scuffle between the Prussians and Wellington, because how the battle to be named, Wellington says, I want to be Waterloo, because that's the name of his headquarters, and he likes that thing, to be always his battles to be named after his headquarters. But actually the Prussians like to call it Belle Alliance, because that's the farmhouse, and also sounds so much nicer, nice alliance, beautiful alliance, and so on. And they have a little bit scuffle how to be named, and both sides name it differently. So if you look at 19th century German maps, you'll find Belle Alliance. If you read on wall, Karl von Clausewitz is Belle Alliance. Only like in recent times in the German language, you call it the Battle of Waterloo. So that's also this kind of interesting moment.
I'm definitely with the Prussians on that. It should have been called La Belle Alliance. It's just such a lovely metaphor, and I think it really would have helped how people remember the battle. What's the personal relationship like between Blücher and Wellington, and how big an impact do you think that had in how things played out?
Well, they're quite different people. I mean, they're constantly in contact, as you said, throughout the campaign, but they're actually very different people. We have Wellington, who's like the great practitioner of defensive warfare. He's like the greatest commander probably ever of the defensive war. And then we have Blücher, who's like this mentality of the hussar, always attack, attack, attack. He's always on the offensive. Famously, when Gerhard von Scharnhorst suggested in 1813 that Blücher has to be the commander of the Prussian troops, he said, like, he's the only one who's not afraid of Napoleon. He's like, there is like, Blücher is, you don't make commanders anymore like this, and probably with a good reason. But like, he's fascinating character. So they're very different people. But again, we have Blücher, that's his mindset, that the hussars mindset that's been talked a lot about it, that he has to support, like, that's what the hussars do. They support the main army. So that's what, whatever it is, he will support Wellington. Also, I think a little bit, we historians like all these anecdotes, personal anecdotes, make great stories. But I think in this case, the personalities do not play such a big role as much as the greater geopolitical interest, because we have Wellington goes into the campaign with completely different objectives than the Prussians. I mean, the objective is stop Napoleon, but everything after that is completely different. Wellington has the objective to stop that war as quickly as possible. So this is we have the Congress of Vienna running at the same time. We have the balance of power. We have this new design for Europe that is creating, and Wellington feels that pressure that that war has to be won as quickly as possible, because the longer this campaign goes, the more problems there will be in Vienna. Prussians come very angry to this battle. They thought France was giving such a generous peace in 1814, and now, the French Napoleon showed up and they celebrated him again. So the Prussians come with France has to be really defeated, utterly defeated, humbled, put on its knees, unable to rise again. So we have completely different completely different outlooks here as goals. So this is why Wellington is proceeds one way and Prussia another way, and why we see that there is a certain uneasiness between the two headquarters. There is problems between the two headquarters, and then there is a difference how they operate. So it's not so much the personalities. I think it's much more the larger politics. The problem is here the larger politics.
Yeah, and you definitely see that when the Allies move into France in 1815, don't you? With Wellington kind of sticking to his policy of, plunder will not be tolerated amongst his troops, whereas the Prussians have that, I wouldn't quite say vengeful stance, but they're quite content
It is vengeful.
You think that's fair? You don't think that's taking it a little bit too far?
Yeah, no need to sugarcoat it. And it's actually, that vengeful mindset. And again, I will bring Karl von Clausewitz as my witness, because yes, I mean, the Prussian troops go, they're really angry. Again, we have to remember Prussia has given enormous, there is enormous casualties in 1813, 1814. Now in 1815, this campaign, for many of the Prussians, that was a necessary campaign that should have never happened. So they are really, really angry. Also, there is a lot of problems with provisioning. The Prussian economy is not that great, so they cannot buy as much of food as Wellington can. So there is also this thing. So there is a lot of looting, but there is also vengefulness. And the Prussian public opinion actually supports that. And we see it that Marie von Clausewitz writes letters to her husband, because she's in Prussia, and she's writing and saying, like, I hope the French get really punished, she's like really angry and so on. And then Clausewitz, who's actually on the ground, and starts seeing that as much as he's not a great friend of the French, but he finds this looting, this punishment and so on, that it's counterproductive, that it should not actually happen the way it is. And he actually writes like really letters where he rebuffs his own wife, where he says like, this policy, what we're doing is it's counterproductive. We shouldn't be doing it. It's not going anywhere. He actually pays a huge homage to Wellington, where he actually, I can even quote it, where Clausewitz says, the history will look kinder upon the role the English played in this campaign, for they haven't come like us full of passion for revenge and compensations, but as a scornful master with noble restraint and impeccable righteousness. In short, they are more honorable than us. So we see that Clausewitz, like I said, he's not a big fan of the French, but he finds the way the Prussians treat the French civilians very distasteful, on personal note, but also counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely easier for the British, and therefore by extension Wellington's Anglo-Dutch force as a commander, to take that perspective, partly because there is that tradition from the Peninsular War with Wellington in command, where he was always incredibly concerned about the need to ensure that his troops didn't plunder the local civilians, because that would then cause the Spanish and Portuguese to turn against him. And he'd seen what had done to the French army in Spain and Portugal. But then equally, Britain hadn't been invaded. And that therefore meant that the population hadn't suffered in the same way that Prussia had.
Yes, that's completely true. That's the problem, but it's one of my colleagues, Everett Dolman, has the phrase that strategy never ends. So once you win a battle, or once you create one reality, then another strategy kicks in. You know, like you won the war, but then now you have to have the strategy for the peace, and now it's like, well, you have defeated the French. How do you build the peace? And that's like, and it requires completely different skill set. How do you build this, the peace? And it requires also to, as a victor, to kind of quiet down your anger, your passion, which is not always easy to do. It's none of these things are easy. Like, it's easy for us to debate them, but they are never easy when you're the commander.
Absolutely. The benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Wellington lamented the fact that he couldn't have his Peninsular War regiments for the Waterloo campaign as he would have liked. And another of the points about the campaign that is often overlooked is that Wellington's own army was made up of Dutch and Belgian forces, some of which were quite raw troops. But the Prussians also had their own issues and problems to deal with in terms of the quality of their army. What headaches did Blucher have to deal with?
Well, this is an army. Actually, when Napoleon comes back to power, Prussia has something like 30,000 troops spread around the border with the Low Countries. So they almost don't have troops. They are in the middle of transformation. We have Gerhard von Scharnhorst has died 1813, but we have now Hermann von Boyen. That's another of his great students, not only Karl von Clausewitz, there is a whole bunch of them. So he is reforming the Prussian army. So the moment when Napoleon comes is actually the worst moment possible for the Prussians. And also Prussia has gained a lot of new territory. So they have now on the east, they have new Polish population that actually many of them have fought for Napoleon. So they have also in the west, they have a lot of territories which also don't see themselves as Prussian. And again, many of them have fought for Napoleon. And then we have Prussia gets a huge chunk of Saxony. Saxony was also ally of Napoleon, so Saxony is really punished. And then the Prussians have to integrate all these different troops in their own. The Saxons actually are the ones that are the unhappiest, and actually the Prussians do it the most, the worst way possible. They handle the Saxon troops because they just start basically on the birthplace. They start separating troops basically on their birthplace. Like, now you're gonna be a Prussian, you're gonna fight in the Prussian army. And like when men fight together, there are those bonds. And like, just the Prussians really handle it bad. So actually we have in the middle of all these things, Napoleon is back and so on, there is a mutiny between the Saxon troops. So the Prussians have very hard time putting that mutiny together. And then no one wants those troops. Even Wellington, the Prussians at some point try to offer him the Saxon troops, and Wellington is like, I don't need that headache, I'm good. So they have to actually send many of the Saxons back. And then Prussia has to raise this new army. And that's, again, there was so many casualties in the previous wars. The country is exhausted. There is a very hard time, actually, the Prussians have really hard time getting new soldiers. There is also no time to train them. So many of the troops just basically barely know how to shoot. Somebody like, it's really interesting, American public knows him much better, which is Franz or Francis Lieber. That's a guy who's going to play a big role in the American Civil War. He as an immigrant, he goes to the United States, but he's born Prussian, so he's 17 and enlists, and he barely knows what he's doing. But like when you read his memoirs, he's basically following whatever the sergeant says and like hopes that it's okay somewhat. So that's a lot of these troops are like this. So the Prussians actually have a huge problem holding those troops together. That's one of the problems why the Battle of Ligny is lost, is because Prussia does not have veteran troops. Some of them just about 8,000 just deserting right like in the middle and in the end of the battle. It's like so it's the whole. So not only coalition warfare, but like fighting with really not the best troops you can fight. It's I mean, what the commanders did in that campaign is quite unbelievable. We have to give them that.
Well, in Blucher's case, a lot of the troops are actually Landwehr, aren't they? Which is, which for people who aren't familiar is kind of a version of militia.
Yeah, they're kind of, that's again, Scharnhorst and so on. That's the idea after 1813. Basically, that's the troops, the troops that they are like the reserve troops, people who somewhat know how to shoot. They actually perform very well, and sometimes they're like older than the, and many of them is like actually the age older than conscription. They are not well equipped, but then some of them have fought in 1813, 1814, so sometimes they actually have more experience than the regular troops. So sometimes it's like, sometimes people look down on the Landwehr, but actually some of the best performances come from the Landwehr and from those veteran units that have been created.
Well, a large part of Thielmann's corps, which was left to hold Wavre and protect the Prussian rear, was made up of Landwehr, wasn't it? Something like 2/3 of it consisted of Landwehr.
So the Third Corps, where Clausewitz is chief of staff, it's led by a Saxon commander, by a Saxon general who switches side. He's one of the few, but he's like the most glorious Saxon commander that the Saxons have, and that's Johann von Thielmann. Great, he has fought with Napoleon in Borodino. He has like one of the great things he does in Borodino, but then he switches sides and so on. So Third Corps, where Clausewitz serves, is actually the least equipped, the least prepared of all the troops. That's why it was actually designated as mostly as reserve. That's probably one of the reasons why actually Karl von Clausewitz was appointed chief of staff there, simply because he comes from this group of military reformers. He's been really good in keeping Walmorden Corps in 1813, 1814 together. So that's why he's actually assigned there. And I think one of the things in Wavre that Clausewitz basically has to order Landwehr units to fight and hold till the end position to the last man, kind of really scars him in a way a little bit. Because these are kind of more civilians, they're not regulars, they're family fathers and so on, and you kind of make them risk their lives, and it's much different. It's in the United States, we will Landwehr troops are like National Guards, what we have in the United States. But they actually, again, they perform actually much better than the regular troops, the regular troops are just 17, 18 years old boys sometimes with no experience whatsoever.
Absolutely. Politically, how significant was Waterloo for the Prussians? Because there had been a lot of tensions between Austria and Prussia over Saxony before the campaign, and the Austrians and the Russians seemed to lose out a bit diplomatically by not having been involved in that final campaign, that final defeat of Napoleon. Do you feel that the Prussians gained anything at the table of international diplomacy as a result of Waterloo?
Well, they wished. There is actually a letter, Gneisenau, August Neidhardt from Gneisenau, that's the chief of staff, Blücher's chief of staff, which kind of we forgot to talk about, but he is actually, we have almost equal partnership. So Blücher is the face of the campaign, he's the charismatic commander and so on, while Gneisenau on the back of it makes most of the strategic plans. So he actually writes a letter to the Prussian to the Prussian Chancellor Hardenberg. He writes him a letter just on the 22nd, actually, on the June 22nd, he writes him a letter and says, like, we have done our job. Now it's your turn. And the letter is kind of really, I mean, mean and like really France, how you should cut France, you know, French territory, sort of really humble France, punish France and make it impossible for France ever to do anything again militarily. Basically what the French did to the Germans after World War I. And the Prussians have every intention to do the same, to do that, to follow up. But what we see is that because the campaign finished so quickly, is that this new structure for Europe, the balance of power, where the countries basically, the big powers balance each other out, and that's how they keep the stability in Europe. Despite Russia's desires, they actually hold back. The other powers managed to hold the Prussians back and balance them out, so kind of isolate Prussia and all these huge demands that the Prussians have. They actually could never, they cannot pull them through. And I should say that's actually, that was the right decision, you know. No matter how much Prussia has suffered and the desires of the Prussians, you know, to humble France, ultimately, if France was cut into pieces like Gneisenau wished, it would have made it, this peace would never have held. It would have destabilized Europe. And this is why decisions like this, they have to be, like, building the peace have to come from a from a place of consideration and removed from all these passions. So yeah, Prussians actually do not succeed. I mean, France loses a little bit of territory, but it goes more to the smaller countries, which is the Netherlands, mostly, yeah.
And if you could explode one myth about the Prussians and the Waterloo campaign, what would it be?
Oh, that would be, of course, for me, is the famous or infamous meeting between Wellington and the Prussian headquarters on the 16th. Sorry, this is before the Battle of Ligny. I think for the British listeners, that's not quite well known, but like if you open the German historiography of the conflict, there is like thousands of pages written on that. So what I'm talking about is right before the Battle of Ligny, where the Prussians will make the stand around the Sombrève, the river Sombrève, and Ligny-Brook and so on, and Wellington is by Quatre-Bras. They meet at 1 o'clock at the windmill, thinking about how they're gonna fight now Napoleon. And Wellington says, like, Blucher once promised, are you going to support me? Because the Prussian right wing is kind of left hanging in the air, but it's because they expect that Wellington will come and support them from that side. So the Prussians ask, you going to support us? And Wellington apparently, he said, I will help you if I can, or I will help you if I'm not attacked myself, while the Prussians take it as he will come, that's a firm, no matter what, he's gonna come. So it's been like, I don't know how much ink has been spilled, whose fault it is, who said what were the actual words, how was minute by minute, like there is people minute by minute, like what might have been said, and so on. And the interesting part for me is how these are very experienced commanders. These are men who's been in so many battles. Coalition warfare for most of them is not nothing new. How could have that happened, that they so misunderstand each other? And this is one of these, like, as Clausewitzians call it, friction or fog of war, or whatever you want. I just wished I was like fly on the wall to actually figure out what happened there.
Absolutely. This is the famous meeting where allegedly Wellington pointed out that the Prussians were quite exposed in their position to artillery fire, because the region is quite, although it has folds in the ground, they're quite kind of gentle. And so allegedly he sort of says, well, look, they're going to get hit by artillery fire. And supposedly Gneisenau turns around and says, well, actually, I should like to see the enemy, in sort of this quite cold, cutting tone. It's one of the few times that somebody seems to have kind of outdone Wellington in a cold, kind of cutting comeback. Do you think that actually happened?
I don't know. Like, Wellington was quite right about that part. He was, and also I think another places that he said, like, that it's the front was too long. That's actually one of the problems of the Battle of Ligny. One of the biggest Prussian mistakes, that they have this huge long front, that they have to spread all their troops and they cannot gather them in time, and so on. So it's one of these cognitive things where people just seem to talk the same language but somehow don't understand each other. And I find it fascinating, because it's, humans are complicated, and that's one of these complicated moments. And
Out of interest, what language did they use when they met, when Wellington and Blucher met at Ligny?
The correspondence, I would say French. The correspondence is actually in French, which is actually a little bit strange in a way, because Gneisenau speaks really good English. He has served under British command in the American Independence War. He was one of the famous Hessians. He was not Hessian at all, but like was what the Americans call the Hessians. Gneisenau was actually, they could have spoken a pretty good English with each other. Might have understood each other. That's like, might have actually understood each other if they spoke English. But it's, it's fascinating how humans act.
You can't help but wonder if that was part of the issue, and whether things kind of got lost in translation, going from English to French to German, and then from German to French to English, and whether that played a part. Because I think Wellington at one point was a bit scathing about Blucher's French, and kind of implied that he wasn't particularly gifted.
Oh yeah, Blucher's French was atrocious. Blucher's French was atrocious. That's not like, there is so many jokes how badly Blucher said things and so on, and like how bad his French was. That's but again, Gneisenau spoke really good French. And I think one of the German authors had this suggestion that Wellington, in a way, sort of had this much positive outlook. Because the problem for Wellington, why he doesn't go and support the Prussians, is because he can, has to concentrate his troops. It takes him a very long time to move them. That's Napoleonic warfare. So you need to move them all from Brussels and concentrate them. So he cannot he still concentrates troops by the end of the, at 7 o'clock, by the end of the day, he's still concentrating troops. So he has his own hands full. Clausewitz actually, in his own study of the 1815 campaign, says it was completely unrealistic from the, whatever Wellington said or not said, Prussians should have done their due diligence. It was unrealistic from them to count on it. But, and maybe that's here the difference between Wellington and Blücher, because Blücher says, whatever, I'll make it work, no matter what, I'll make it work. And Wellington is much more the more considerate commander.
I must say, I'm not in a position to criticize anyone's French, as people who've listened to this podcast will know. Whenever I try and attempt to pronounce something that's not in English, it seems to become the latest laughingstock of Twitter. Quite rightly, I should say. One final question from me.
My French is not much better. So.
One final question from me. What's Waterloo's significance for you?
Waterloo, okay, it's a great battle. It's the drama. You cannot make up these things, That's like drama better than anything Hollywood can do, Every time you read those accounts, it's just, if you don't get goosebumps and you not continue reading those eyewitness accounts, you're not a human, okay? That's just. But then I teach active duty officers. I teach practitioners of war. So I think Waterloo, for me, it's very interesting first to talk about coalition warfare, because we continue to have those problems. That's like Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever you want, Syria. And it's interesting to talk about these things, and then students make connections to their own experience. But then the meaning for me is really interesting, the meaning of decisive battle, what we call decisive battle. Because if you look, people have this idea decisive battle is, we fought the enemy and the enemy was defeated, and then and there the enemy asked for peace and the war was over. So that's what people think about decisive battle. So in these terms, Waterloo is not decisive battle because the war continued. But then that challenges, Waterloo challenges the simplistic narrative what it is decisive battle. And actually Waterloo is decisive battle in the real meaning of decisive battle, a battle that basically brought a big decision, just not what the general public thinks about decisive battle. And then my officers sometimes tend to say well, we don't have any more decisive battles and war has changed so much, and why we don't get any more decisive battles, and then you look at the Waterloo, so many things had to happen for that battle to become a decisive battle. So many political decisions, so many military decisions, so many things had to be overcome. The Prussian distrust against Wellington, Wellington's trust in the Prussians. So, and then the pursuit and working together despite having different interests. So that's well, think about it. What are the conditions to create decisive battle? Think long and hard what makes decisive battle. And I think in these terms, Waterloo is just not only a great battle, but it's battle we can learn so much from, battle we have to study and look beyond the simplistic narrative, because it's one of the most interesting battles that we ever had, and one of the most consequential battles in world history.
Vanya, it's been an absolute joy talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me for Waterloo Remembered. That was the historian Vanya Bellinger from the United States Command School. You can follow Vanya on Twitter @VanyaEF, and her book, Marie von Clausewitz, The Woman Behind the Making of On War, is available to order online now. The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals who have said them and do not represent an official position of the United States Air Force. If you have any questions or comments, remember that you can get involved on Twitter using the hashtag WaterlooRemembered or in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net, where you will find a dedicated room for Waterloo Remembered. Join me tomorrow when I'll be speaking to the historian Ed Koss as we discuss what it was like to be a soldier during this period in A Soldier's Life for Me. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been Waterloo Remembered from The Napoleonicist. Take care, my friends, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.